think we're live. All right, we're going to give it just a couple of minutes before we get started. We're going to be doing Uncommon History of the South live podcast. If somebody's on there and you can hear us, if you would hit a thumbs up, just make sure the audio is working. We're using some new mics tonight. This is the first time we've used the system. So if you're listening, if you wouldn't care just to give us a thumbs up, make sure the audio's good. We're using some new mics tonight. I don't know if it'll show up on there or not. But we'll get started in just a second. We're going to give it a few minutes, let a few more people get on. Also, if you don't care, make sure you like our... hey, Terry Hogue, can you hear the audio okay? Can you send us a message? Okay, we've got a couple people on now. Could somebody just send them? Okay, let us know the audio's working. There it is. All right,
okay,
great. Using a new system tonight, so
thanks everybody.
Appreciate you all being on. So we'll get started.
How much time we got till we go over podcast?
Hello and welcome to Uncommon History of the South. I'm Brian.
And I'm Harold.
Harold, it's been a couple weeks since we've been able to actually do a podcast. But in the meantime, you've started on a new build.
Yes.
How's that going? What are you working on? Tell us about it.
Well, trying to step up a little bit in skill level from the Model A, which may or may not work, but we'll see. But, you know, you got to challenge yourself. I like to take on things and learn. You know, if I had it all figured out before I started it, I probably wouldn't enjoy it as much, you know.
Yeah.
But it's got to be aggravating and cost you extra money before it's fun, you know. But anyway, it's a 1925 Studebaker that was in a fire. And it ruined it, basically, the body. I mean, it was a beautiful car. It was what they call a points car, and it was a very well restored and everything. And it was in a building that caught fire beside a building, which scorched it really severely as far as the body. And so, long story short, ended up making a deal for it, and we're stripping it down. We're going to rebuild it as a speedster, which is about all you can do, other than just to put it back in its original state. It would cost more than it would ever be worth.
Right.
So anyway, we're going to do that. We'll probably we ought to go out to the garage one night and do this a Facebook thing and let people see some of this stuff and what we're into and so forth.
Well, you know, that's one of the things we've talked about is maybe doing this podcast and one more to end season 2. But I think until we start season 3, maybe we could do some short videos.
Right.
We could talk about your rifles. We can go out to the park, do some other things, and definitely do the vehicle. Right. I think that would be a good one. Yeah,
there's a whole car culture out there, and like I said, I never was a car guy, so this is all kind of new to me in a sense the last 4 or 5 years. But there's a vintage racing group out there, and they're all over the United States, all over the world actually, especially popular in England. And so the pre-war cars, which means in America pre-World War II,
right.
And they actually, over in England, Goodwood and these other tracks, they race them. So anybody wants to go on YouTube and Google pre-war racing, I think my wife is tired of watching. I'm on there all the time.
Surely not.
Yeah, sure. If she's not around.
All right. So what happened today in Kentucky history?
All right. November the 18th. In 1861, the Confederate Sovereignty Convention was held at a fellow's house named William Frost in Russellville, Kentucky, and which called for secession from the Union and declared Kentucky a Confederate state, and with the state capital in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Did you know that?
No.
Yes.
So the Confederate capital was in Bowling Green.
Well, that convention, and then, you know, they tried to install that in Frankfurt.
Okay.
And then, of course, the Union came in and they fled the state, you know, and so forth. Anyway, in 1861, the Confederate Sovereignty Convention was held. In 1949, Alben Barkley became the only vice president to wed in office.
Really?
Yes. He married Janie Hadley. He was 71. Guess how old she was?
I'm going to guess she was 18.
No, she's a little older than that. He was 71. This was 1949.
No, 49. So she was probably 23.
37.
37.
Still robbing the cradle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Barkley was a widower, though. So anyway, he was the only vice president to win in office. 1953, the first meeting of the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable was held at the University of Kentucky, and Dr. Holman Hamilton was the speaker. In 2004, Big Bone Lick State Park officially opened, located in Boone County, the birthplace of American paleontology.
And you know, I've never been there. No, I want
haven't
to go.
either.
I want to go up there, and I want to go to Big Bone Lick State Park and
Are
Army.
you like me? How many times have you driven by there and said, man, I need to stop, but I don't have time today?
Yeah.
How many times? I don't know how many times.
Several times.
And I've always been fascinated by stuff. And so, you know, maybe we'll just take off and go do a podcast there.
There you go. So is that all in Kentucky history?
Yes.
So this is going to be part 3 of Sue Monday. So we'll be wrapping up Sue Monday, the boy named Sue.
Yes.
All right.
As we mentioned in our previous podcast, his real name was Marcellus Jerome Clark, and he got the name tacked on him, Sue Monday, by George Prentice, the editor of the Louisville Daily Journal, and we went through this in a previous podcast. So we're picking this up at part 3. We're going to start time-wise in February of 1865.
Okay.
And we had previously talked about Brian, about Quantrell and the Missouri guerrillas coming to Kentucky,
Right.
about these Kentucky guerrillas kind of joining forces, and this all became quite a formidable force there for a little while. And they weren't very well organized, and we had mentioned that we didn't fully understand what their objectives were, if they were any, other than pillaging and robbing. You know, it's hard to understand what the mindset of these people were. But in February of 1865, February 18th to be exact, the Kentucky guerrillas attacked Fort Jones in Colesburg, Kentucky. And there the 12th Colored Infantry, artillery, was stationed. And this raid, it seems like it was led by Henry Magruder. At different times we had different people leading it, so it's kind of hard to know, was Sue Monday in charge, was Magruder, Bill Marion, who was in charge. But Magruder seemed to be in charge at this place, 31 men strong. They killed 3 men and robbed a number of citizens. They stopped at a farmhouse with a fellow named John Lilly, and he wrote a journal about his life, and it was interesting how he explained what happened to him. He said the guerrillas came and stopped and exchanged 2 horses. Now, exchange meant they left him 2 tired, wore-out horses and took 2 of his fresh horses. But later in that day, Captain Robert Young, a Federal, came and took his fancy bird gun, he said, worth $50 to $75, 2 coats and a pair of gloves worth $40. So it seems like it don't matter which side you's on, you's going to lose.
Yeah.
But in this case, the guerrillas actually treated him better. They at least left him with 2 wore-out horses instead of no horses at all.
Yeah.
And so the Federals actually took more from him than these guerrillas did. There was a drastic change of tactics for these guys about this time. Now, they weren't dumb. They were pretty shrewd. They began to realize that this war was not going to go their way. They knew that things were, they could see no light at the end of this
See the
tunnel.
writing on the wall.
Right. So in February of 1865, right after this event, Magruder, Sue Monday, Henry Metcalf, Jim Jones, and Henry Porter, and some others, and we don't know exactly who because you never can put exactly who was where with these guys. They came to the conclusion that it was time for them to rejoin a regular army. And that way, when the war was over, they could be paroled instead of hung as guerrillas. So they moved west. They headed southwest. They were headed probably to Missouri, to General Lyons, Lyons, and they were going to join up with him. And of course, out there, people wouldn't know them,
Right.
or know about what they did here as much,
Have
and
a
maybe
little
they could
anonymity.
and they could possibly be paroled out there where they be really hard here.
Right.
And in Hancock County, they robbed, as they headed west, they robbed James Snyder's store at Paleville. They got him for about $315 plus some other stuff and 3 good horses. And at Purcell Farm, they had stolen also some horses, and on as they go, they take as they go as they need. Well, then they got down in Breckinridge County, and they came to a house and demanded food, stole more horses from a neighbor, and they made this owner of the house, this Mr. Tall, ride with them. And they put him on a pony without a saddle. You know, I don't. Were they drinking? Probably. I don't know. They put this guy on a pony, and then they made fun of him. And he almost got, he couldn't stay on it, but they made him stay up with them. And I'm sure that was a miserable thing for him to try to stay on this bareback pony.
Oh,
and
sure.
no pony ever rides good, if you remember.
No.
There they were joined by a guy named Bill Davis, and near Cloverport, the guerrillas were spotted by 3 Federals. These 3 Federal troopers, Silas Taylor, Charles Hale, and a guy named William Stennett. And this was 1st of March, the 3rd in 1865. This was the beginning of the end. They did not have any idea of the onslaught that was getting ready to come down upon them. So they got to this Pate farm there on the county line, and these 3 brave Federal guys, they were outnumbered tremendously, opened fire, but with rifles on the guerrillas. And after an exchange of fire, Stennett, the Federal guerrilla chaser, he took off and left his 2 buddies there. And so the 2 of them had dismounted, and they were hiding behind trees, and they had this gun battle went on for about 45 minutes, and finally they made their way to a log cabin. Right before they got to the log cabin, one of them had peeked out behind this tree and got a clear shot at Bill Davison, one of the Confederate guerrillas, and shot him in the right arm, and it went through the arm and hit him in the chest, which would prove to be a fatal wound. The 2 other Federals, the 2 Federals that had got to the log cabin, in about 45 minutes of fighting the guerrillas, more Federal officers showed up. So Stennett, what he had done, he wasn't necessarily running from them. He run to get help from the others because he knew they were outnumbered. So more began to arrive, and I think it got up to like 45 of them. And they chased Magruder and shot him and hit him in the left chest. The bullets didn't go all the way through him. It just stuck in his lungs. The Jones was killed with some 16 bullets shot into him. And then Magruder, even though he was wounded, he gave the directions for the rest of them to go to a cousin of his house. He had the presence of mind to know that he had a cousin that lived in the area, and they escaped, and they had gotten to this cousin to hide. It's really remarkable how they knew. They had different connections everywhere they went. They knew somebody.
Yeah.
Magruder, wounded pretty seriously, was taken to a farm where he was attended by Jerome Clark, and he forced this farm owner by the name of Claycom's son Green to bring him food. Magruder told Henry Porter to take the rest of the men and go back to Nelson County. Now, we always talked about how Nelson County was a haven for them.
Right.
So Sue Mundy, Henry Metcalf, and Magruder stayed. And then the next day or two, the 3 remaining guerrillas went to the John Cox farm. And this was right on the Breckinridge County line there. And this was the biggest mistake they made, is by staying in that area. I guess they thought Magruder was too badly wounded to move. So they got to this barn, tobacco barn of a Dr. Jesse Lewis, the John Cox farm. Dr. Jesse Lewis was the doctor that came and tended to Magruder. So he was getting some medical attention. Bill Davison, after he had been shot severely, he made it to a cousin of his named Thomas Newman, which was a few miles away. And they took him back in the woods to this cabin, secluded place, because these Federals were everywhere looking for him. So they took him back to this log cabin, but he died of his wounds on March the 7th of 1865. he asked to be buried near that cabin. He did not want to, for whatever reason, he wanted to be buried there. So they granted him his wishes and they buried him there. The next episode was Captain Lewis Marshall had about 50 federal troops, Company B of the 30th Wisconsin Volunteers, under the command of Cyrus Wilson, Major Cyrus Wilson. They arrived at Brandenburg aboard the Gray Eagle steamship. They marched about 10 miles to the Cox farm. They had been telegraphed to come there, that the guerrillas were hiding in that barn, so they had a plan to take them. And when they arrived there, Dr. Lewis pointed out their hiding place. They knocked on the door of the barn. Believe it or not, just walked up and knocked. He said Sue Mundy came out shooting with both pistols, pistol in each hand, just started shooting. A couple of the guys was wounded, a couple of soldiers was wounded. One soldier, he just, his name John White, he was killed. They kept telling him to get down and get back, and he wouldn't. And so he got hit right in the chest, and he died on the site. Cyrus Wilson went back to the barn. Now here's where it gets interesting for me, is Miss Wilson must have been a pretty good talker, because these guys were, they were backed in a corner, they were desperate.
Right.
And he talked Sue Mundy or Jerome Clark into sitting down with him and talking. Said, let's just sit down and have a talk. So they sat down and smoked and had a talk. Sue Mundy asked him, he said, are you going to hang me now? Are you going to hang me if I don't give up? He said, no, I'm not going to hang you, but he said, I'm going to take you back to Louisville. He said, I'm pretty sure they'll hang you there.
Yeah.
I mean, he was pretty honest with him.
Yeah.
But he said, if you don't go with me, you'll have no chance. Because he said, we will take you back dead or alive. So he gave him a few minutes to think about it, so they surrendered. So they were taken to put aboard the Morning Star steamer and traveled north back to Louisville.
Well, how much did Sue Mundy and Frank and Jesse James, did their paths cross? How much? Did they have any kind of thing?
Well, we'll never know for sure. We know they ran together. We talked about him raiding the horse farm at Midway, Kentucky in the last podcast, but at this point, they seem to be fragmented everywhere. See, Quantrell's whole bunch didn't stay together. Sue Mundy's bunch didn't stay together. So you had these little groups, and I've studied this stuff probably 30 years, and I can't make total sense of it, no.
Okay.
And I can't, other than some obvious objectives like what we were just talking about, to make their way to Missouri to get with the regular army so they could be paroled. It's hard to understand what their motives were, what they were trying to accomplish. And I'm not sure if they could talk to you today, they would even know what to tell you. But they seem to be moved by opportunity, revenge, but I don't see a military objective, and that's the thing that I can't make these guys regular soldiers.
Yeah, they're more profiteers than...
Yeah, and that was true, like I said, both sides, not just Confederate side.
Right.
Well, they made it back to Louisville. Magruder's wounds were not that bad. He was shot in the lung, but it didn't break any major blood vessels, and that's why his pulse and things were good when they got him back. They checked that stuff, and of course he was put in a military hospital. Jerome Clark was put on trial on March the 14th, and he claimed right off the bat to be a regular Confederate soldier. He blamed all the wrongdoing on Quantrell and Captain Bill Marion. And his trial didn't last long. I have a copy of his trial in there. I went to the National Archives some years ago, and I got a copy of the trial. And there were several witnesses called, but it only lasted a day. And he was sentenced to be hanged on March the 15th, 1865. So, he didn't have much of a defense. There wasn't much of a defense there. I don't know if there's what the point would have been, but anyway.
Right.
Now this guy that he blamed everything on sent a letter to the Louisville Daily Journal. Now this newspaper with George Prentice, the editor, this seems to be the public format for the guerrillas too. he would publish, if they sent him a letter, he would publish it. So Bill Marion sent a letter to him telling him that if you harm any of my men, these 3 prisoners you have, he said, I'll kill 50 Union men. And so he published the letter, but it was on March the 25th, 1865, after Sue Mundy was hung.
Yeah.
So this Reverend Talbot of St. John's Church visited Marcus Jerome Clark, Sue Mundy, there in the prison. He asked him if he had any, concerns about his soul. He of course witnessed to him, and he said that he asked him if he wanted to write any letters to anybody. And he said, yeah, I've got 3 or 4 people that I would like to write a letter to. So he wrote one to a great aunt and foster mother who was named Mary Tibbs. He wrote one to a sister of his named Mary Elizabeth Barker, I'm sorry. A cousin, Charles Bradshaw, he evidently thought a lot of. But you remember the story about the girlfriend,
Mm-hmm.
Mary Porter, or Thomas, we called her Molly, of Chaplin, Kentucky. He wrote her a letter, and I'll read it to you. He said, my dear Molly, I have to inform you that of the sad fate of which awaits your true friend. I am to suffer death this afternoon at 4 o'clock. I send you from my chains a message of true love. As I stated on the brink, stand on the brink of the grave, I do truly, fondly, and forever love you. I am truly yours, Marcus Jerome Clark.
Huh.
So there was a guy to witness this hanging of Sue Mundy. Now you got to understand, this guy had, because of the newspapers, because of the press of the day, making these guys just notorious in Kentucky. You can imagine the crowd that was gathered in the biggest town that we had in the state at that time was in Louisville. There was a young writer there named E Allison. His name is young, E Allison. And for those that know Kentucky literature know that name very well. He was 12 years old when he watched this happen. It was on the corner of 18th and Broadway. Today, if you go down there, the scaffold was built there. And he said that Clark was taken out of the prison. He was put in, only his legs was in irons, his hands were free. This Reverend Talbot was with him, and he covered his face with a handkerchief. Said he wasn't crying, but said just wanted to cover his face. He said there was a military band playing the Dirge March, which was, he said, very sobering.
Mm-hmm.
He was marched to the scaffold. He said he showed no emotion. Said his lips kept moving and thought he was praying, and he kept saying, Lord, have mercy on my soul. His last statement, they asked him if he had anything he'd like to say. He said, I have lived and died for the Confederate cause. When he was hung, he was 20 years old.
Wow.
So you think about how young these guys were. They had just started life.
Yeah.
And they had witnessed so much and been a part of so much violent, brutal stuff. The scene was pretty hectic. Now, strangely enough, a bull got loose from the local stockyards. And some, like I said in a lot of things, you can't make this stuff up. But I don't know if somebody ran it down there or it got down there on its own or whatever, but they said it was right in the middle of the street, slinging dirt everywhere. And everybody fleeing, and they all thought that was possibly the other guerrillas coming to rescue him, and maybe run some cattle through there to stampede or whatever. But anyway, no.
Maybe the bull was a Confederate.
Who knows? But anyway, wild rumors, the town was in upheaval for some time because they thought that these guerrillas would come back and burn the place down, and they just, how mob mentality sometimes can get. But what's really strange about this, Brian, is that when they got ready to hang him, they took his cap off and they threw it under the scaffold, and they put the hood over him and then put the noose, like you've seen in the movies. Well, they fought over his jacket and that hat. And I thought that was kind of strange. And some said they fought over it because, not for souvenirs, but because they thought he'd sewed money in the lining. Mm. And there was a brawl over this over this jacket, and I know I had seen those Kentucky buttons, that a Kentucky button, a state seal button that supposedly come off of his jacket, and who knows if it really was or not. But the vice was tightening on these guerrillas in Kentucky. Quantrell's demise, you know, we talked about they had see the end coming, but did Quantrell? I don't know. He didn't seem to change a whole lot. He still stayed in Kentucky. I don't know if he had a place to go. See, I think he couldn't go back to Missouri because that was worse than what he got into here.
Yeah.
So I don't know if he ran out of places to go. I don't know where he went other than maybe to Mexico, if he could have got to Mexico or something. It was first part of May, I think May the 10th, 1865. Him and 15 men, it was pouring down rain. Terrible day. They had ridden down the road there in Bloomfield, Kentucky, between Bloomfield and Springfield, Kentucky. There's a little area there called Wakefield. And the farmer's name was James Hetty Wakefield. He had the town was named after that family. They'd been there for many years. And his house and farm, and I've been to it, it sits way back off the road, quite a ways, maybe a mile or so off the road there it is today. The road that you go through there today, where the historic marker is in the same place it always was. The difference was there was actually a railroad spur that went through there.
Okay.
And you can still, if you know where to look, you can still see that railroad spur through there. Again, like I said, it was pouring down rain. There was a blacksmith, a Negro blacksmith there, that had a shop right at the bottom of the hill where you go up the hill to the Wakefield farm. And his name was Olmsted Jacobs. Quantrell and his bunch come riding through. They went up the hill. They were headed to Mr. Wakefield's. They had been there before. They knew him well. He had a big barn out beside his house, and they had was wanting to get to that barn to get out of the rain, you know, just as a refuge. So they had gotten there. A few months later, Edwin Terrell and his group of federal guerrilla chasers just happened to be coming down by circumstance, did not know that these guerrillas were there. They came down the road and they saw, now these guys were pretty sharp. I guess they're used to tracking people and everything, and they saw all these hoof prints going up the hill, so they knew that had to be a group of guerrillas or soldiers.
Right.
So they stopped and asked this blacksmith, they said, hey, did you see a bunch of men go by there? He said, yeah, I saw them go up there, but I don't know who they were. So he said but they were armed. They were guerrillas. So he knew where all the Federals were, so he knew that had to be some of the guys he was after.
Right.
So he rides up this hill and rides in on them, and it's pouring down rain. Well, Quantrell's men, they were laying around in the hay, throwing corn cobs at one another, drinking whiskey, drying out, had their clothes hanging up. You know, you can just imagine the scene. They had no idea what was ready to ride down on them. So Dick Glasscock looks up and he sees them coming, and he hollers, here they come, boys. And so they all started jumping and running and trying to grab horses and grab their guns, and you can imagine the scene. Well, Quantrell rushes out, and he has a new horse that he had his other horse, old Charlie, that he had had for years, that was such a good guerrilla horse, had come hamstrung or something. He had to put him down, and he'd got a new horse, and that horse wasn't used to that, and he couldn't get on him. He couldn't mount him. He couldn't get him to stand still long enough with all the shooting and everything. So Quantrell runs down, and he tries to jump on the back of the horse of another guerrilla. And when he did, they shot him, and he got hit right in the spine. It paralyzed him immediately, and then they shot at him again, and it shot his trigger finger off. Really? Believe it or not, they hit his finger and shot his finger off. There was two other guys that were killed in this fracas: Clark Hockensmith and a fellow named Dick Glasscock. And Glasscock and Hockensmith are buried in the cemetery there in Bloomfield. I've been to their graves several times. Different groups I've toured and taken them there and everything. Quantrell was taken to the Wakefield House. Now this is interesting because when Terrell shoots him, he don't know who he is. He really doesn't know him. Now he's after this guy for 6 months or a year and doesn't know when he ran into him that's who it was.
Yeah.
So he asked him who he was, and he said he was Captain Clark with the 4th Missouri Cavalry. So he just lies to him, and so they take him to the house, and they tell Mr. Wakefield, they said, no, we're going to leave him here, and we're going to go after the others, and if he's not here when we get back, we'll burn this place to the ground. And then they pillaged Mr. Wakefield's house because they thought since he was harboring guerrillas that that'd give them the right to rob him and take what they wanted from him, which they did.
Right.
And they left, and they come back a couple days later, and during this time, this 2 days, Frank James was in Deatsville, Kentucky, and he got wind that one of the guys had got to him and told him what had happened. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, he takes off and rides back to Wakefield, takes a chance of getting caught, and goes into Quantrell and says, hey, if you want to get out of here, I'll get you out of here. And Quantrell said, no. He said, leave me alone. I'm a dying man. I don't want to be moved. He said, I can't feel my legs. I can't ride. I don't want to be moved. I want to die here. So Frank James and him exchange last words, and Frank rides away. The last time he'd ever see his partner in crime there. Quantrell is taken to Louisville. Finally, Terrell figures out who he's got. Of course, he goes to his head man. I mean, he's captured the notorious Quantrell. He's taken to the U.S. Military Prison Hospital in Louisville, where he lives for 27 days. And then he dies. And then he's buried, Quantrell is buried in Portland Cemetery in Louisville. Now, Brian, it would take an hour to talk about the burial of Quantrell and the reburial of his bones. And sometime when we covered some other subjects, we might come back to this, and I want to do a story just on the bones of William Clark Quantrell, because it's quite a story. But anyway, he was temporarily buried at Portland Cemetery in Louisville. Fate of the other guerrillas. We'll talk about One-Armed Sam Berry, the longest held prisoner of the Civil War. He was in prison till July the 4th, 1873. He was 36 years old. He was originally sentenced to be hung, and then they commuted it to life of hard labor. He was in the process of probably going to be released, and then he gets a fever. I don't know which one or what type, but he dies before he can get out, and that's in 1873. Probably as far as we know, the longest held prisoner of the Civil War. Jim Davis, one of the other guerrillas, this guy had a form of epilepsy, and that, believe it or not, probably saved his life, because he was to be executed, and he had seizures. And so at that time, they did not know if that was, some type of mental illness or whatever. And because of his ill health, he was released in April of 1867. So he was paroled and went on and lived a normal life. Henry Turner, one of the other guerrillas, sentenced to be hung, was commuted to 10 years. And then he was released in April of 1866. So he served probably less than a year. Black Dave Martin, the guy that had the worst name of the bunch, like the mystery mean Black Dave Martin. He was paroled by Palmer. He didn't serve at all.
Really?
So evidently his, he wasn't the dark, mean individual that, when you think of black, you think of evil or the black heart,
Yeah.
That's kind of the context that I took that in. But no, he paroled by Palmer. He didn't even serve a day. Thomas Henry was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor, but was released a year later. Now, I'll wind this up by talking about Jerome Clark's burial. He was taken back to Simpson County, Kentucky, which is down on the southern border of Kentucky, to the family cemetery. And then they put a road through there, and they were going to have to move these graves. And so they had to dig him up. Well, there were some people that were alive that knew him. There was one guy that was still living that actually had seen him, and they said, we want to make sure that that's who this is. So, believe it or not, they opened the casket, opened the coffin, and he said, yep, that was him. He still could see the gray hair, the gray uniform and the long hair, and he said the real giveaway was his neck was broke. So he was pretty sure that was because of a hanging.
The hanging, yeah.
So he was reinterred in a cemetery there in Greenville, Kentucky.
Wow. All right. So thank you for being part of Uncommon History of the South. If you would like to help support our podcast, please share our podcast with your friends and family. Make sure to subscribe for free on Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, iHeart Music, YouTube, or your favorite podcast listening app. And if you listen to our podcast on Apple, it would do us a big favor if you would leave us a 5-star review and a comment. This will get us a higher ranking and it'll help others find our podcast. To find out more about the podcast, keep up with what we're doing, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, Christmas is coming up. Don't forget to check out our store. We've got great merch. The links will be in our show notes. Uncommon History of the South is created and produced by Harold Edwards and Brian Wolford. That's it. Well, thank you for everybody that watched us on Facebook. And like I say, Harold and I are going to try to do more videos, a little different format. We may video something different than us just recording our podcast, but we're going to try to do his car and maybe do some other locations, and we'll put those videos on Facebook. So if you would go over to Uncommon History of the South on YouTube, if you would go over to Uncommon History of the South and subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified, that'll help us grow our YouTube page as well. So we appreciate it and hope you enjoyed it. You want to say anything?
Thank you all very much. We sure enjoy having you all with us.
All right.